is in the LCS, the team that won the last split was obviously Cloud9, this team that had all the big perk signing and then the whole gamble of Fudge and blah, blah, blah. And they went to MSI. This year there was one. And obviously they underwhelmed because they didn't make it to the playoffs. And let's be real, if you are from any of the classic 4 regions, because I have to say, I know LMS isn't a region anymore, but fucking hell, their team is still better than LCS most times. So I know that's not classically a region, but if you think of the big 4, right, one of the reasons I actually kind of have come round to Dom's perspective that MSI isn't actually that good a tournament is, bear in mind, there's only one team from each of those major 4 regions. The minimum should be making top 4. Like, if you're from the LEC, you should, like, celebrate. Like, I made the semis. It's like, what the fuck was the alternative? What, that some team from, like, fucking Turkey made it over you? Like, that's not the same vibe as, like, I made out of groups at Worlds. At Worlds, there might be, like, 3... I mean, now there's going to be 4 LCK and 4 LPL teams. That is an achievement to make it out of groups, potentially. Even then, it depends what group you're in. So, basically, right, the thing I've noticed is... all the discussion going into MSI was stuff like, will perks fail? Oh, is Fudge going to be good in the tournament or whatever? But because of the way it ended and the fact that the tournament, like, actually they sort of shit the bed in some of the key moments, it then just became about things like classic narrative. Is Zven a choker? Does he just, collapse at certain times? Obviously, the whole blabber thing, because he'd be the MVP, people heavily focused on. So it led to this scenario where when they came home, even though I would think the logical thing it would be is you just run it back. You take the same lineup, you go to the next split, you see how it does. You take the experience from MSI, you go to Worlds with it. Instead, Cloud9, bizarrely, has chosen to actually bench Zven, which I find very bizarre, because if people don't know, one of the other factors behind their Fudge signing, it's actually what me and Rich talked about on that episode of Thorin's Rotations at the end of the off-season, is that potentially they were also making that move. This is where fans don't think ahead like a general manager. They were also potentially doing that move a bit cynically, because when Zven becomes a resident, now you can also potentially just replace the Fudge guy with another import. You could just have 5 import. I mean, I know Vulcan technically isn't import yet, but eventually you could go to a 5 import lineup essentially, which, if you notice, a lot of the big orgs in America have at least left the door open for that. They've at least sort of half planned that they can maneuver that way. So now this move happens where you would think Zven must be part of the long-term plans, because that's why you've had him the last couple of years. Apparently now he is benched. As a result, will be an academy player. They bring in this player called King, who obviously no one watches academy in America. No one really knows who this guy is. He's obviously like a guy they're trying to test out. And it's led to all this potential discussions. There's a million angles we can go with on this, Rich. So I want to get your thoughts first. Basically, this could either be specific to him and what you think about him as a player, the case. Obviously, it can be about things like, I saw Doublelift on his stream. This is part of why people are discussing it. Basically brought it up where he was trying to flex on the angle of, like, you're in contract prison. And he was even trying to do this weird thing where he was sort of like trying to make it seem really predatory that, like, the team owners have people on contract, but then don't just let them go to whatever team they want. So bizarrely, Doublelift essentially is a Fnatic fan saying that, perks should just be allowed to go to their team even if you have it on contract. So whatever. There's that angle. There's obviously, I know you work obviously like as an agent, so there's the whole thing of, like, we can talk about things like what happens when you get benched, etc. So where do you want to start here, Rich? What's the initial thing that appeals to you about this topic?
Yeah, so I think I'll give my initial thought and then kind of address that Doublelift angle. So my initial thought is that I'm surprised, I'm a little confused, and I'm actually kind of interested. This is one of those things where it's like, if you do a reflections with Zven in like a few years' time, I'd be really interested to see what actually happened, because Zven as a person, incredibly amicable, very nice, like no history of not getting on with teammates or anything like that. So I'm kind of ruling out a default angle of this guy's toxic and bad for team environment, right? Like, in my opinion, unless something very specific happened which could have prompted some kind of response like that, I kind of rule that out in my head as a possibility. Then obviously you look at the performance side. Was Zven like exemplary at MSI? No, definitely not. Was he like the worst performer? I don't think so. And are you upgrading him by replacing him with King? I would be, lying if I said I knew much about King. But I think on the face of it, it seems like a strange move to me, and I wonder what the motivations are behind it. And I'm thinking maybe this is just my best guess, that maybe they're like going for this thing they kind of did with Sneaky a while back, where it's like they're benching him in the hope that he'll become like reinvigorated and motivated or something. Like maybe it's like one of these psychological angles. That's what I initially went to. In sort of addressing what Doublelift said about, contract jail and all the rest of it. I think, there was a time, particularly in other esports, to be honest, but also to a certain extent in League, where players were essentially preyed on. And does it still happen? Yeah, absolutely. Is it super regular in the big Western orgs that players just get completely like smashed around and dumped on? No, not really, to be honest. Usually, you know, first of all, most players have some kind of representation these days when they sign, whether that be like a legal expert specifically or whether it be an agent. And even though, you know, I'm sure there are people who malpractice to a certain extent, usually it's not in the agent or the lawyer's interest, especially to like screw the guy over in contract negotiations, right? And there are lots of, you know, what some would call like fall clauses, or, you know, basically sub/a CAD clauses, where if a player gets benched, it's not like this guy just loses, you know, 3/4 of his salary and everything else. Like, this guy will still be getting paid pretty well, I'm sure, on Cloud9 relative to what he was already being paid. In terms of, you know, what you alluded to, like, oh, this guy, you know, if he wants to leave, he shouldn't be allowed to leave. This is what I would call like a fan argument, and it's essentially just goes back to sort of their general ethos of we are more fans of the player than we are the team, which I think is still the case. And I want what's best for my Weibo pillow cutout player that I've attached myself to. He should be allowed to do whatever he wants, which is complete nonsense. And esports would collapse as a business if the players were literally allowed to come and go as they please. So yeah, I think overall I'm surprised. As I said, if I had to guess, I would guess that Zven will be back in the starting lineup at some point during the split. Maybe that's slightly unfair to King, and I am ignorant when it comes to speaking about King. I don't know anything about the guy, but my guess would be that he's back. And in terms of do I believe that this guy's been screwed over by Cloud9? No, I don't think so. And I'm kind of interested by the move because, you know, one thing I've always respected about certain organizations like G2, for example, is that they won the split, right? Sure, they didn't have the best performance at MSI, but I think it's really, I don't want to overstate it, but I think it's somewhat brave to make changes when you are the winning team in your region, rather than just to sit on what you've done and be like, well, we won last time, so we're just going to run it back and hopefully it will go well. That's safe. That wouldn't ruffle any feathers. Obviously, this did ruffle feathers, but at the same time, I don't know what the merits are behind the decision, but I like that Cloud9 historically has not been afraid to make changes, even if it upsets fans.
Right, Wicked, obviously, again, there's a load of angles on this one, but like, do you have any that springs out to you? I can craft one for you, like the obvious pro angle to me.
Stuff.
Yeah, go on.
From my perspective, like Rich said that Zven wasn't performing that well at MSI, right? From my perspective as a player, I feel like the bot lane of C9 was performing extremely well. I would even put them as the second best bot lane in MSI. Besides RNG's bot lane, they were way too good, right? And the thing is, this doesn't make any sense to me that they're changing him out, because I feel like he's a hard worker. He's been top of the ladder the whole time. Unless there's some drastic problems in the team that he's a part of, it doesn't make any sense to me, because so the problem is, like, C9 team is super good right now, and I think at MSI the only reason it didn't make it was because of small problems in the team and not in the individual players. And Zven was one of the best performing players on that team together with Vulcan in my eyes. It was more so other players in that team that were making the mistakes from what I could see. And then changing a player after that, it doesn't make any sense. I would like to hear much more from Cloud9 on why this actually happened, which we probably won't. One thing I could see, they said they wanted him to lead the academy team, which I guess maybe they wanted to boost up the academy team. That could be an angle to look at, because that would make a lot of sense, because he's been in the scene for a long time. He got a lot of experience, and I know he's very vocal, which is obviously good for a newer team or an academy team.
I have a lot of problems with this type of move, because here's the problem, right? I'll set it up initially as like a nuanced take, because the issue I have is this, right? It is true on almost every talk show, because even if they say a reason why, even if the player does an interview, you can never really trust how much of that's true or how much is, you know, what they want the public to believe about the move, etc. The problem is we can never really know internally what the issue is. Like, the classic example would be, even if you hear someone's like a bit toxic, you don't know how bad that is. Like, if they really are having like fucking Forgiven type scenarios where they're just like basically chewing people out like directly to their face and stuff, well then in that scenario, yeah, it might be inappropriate on the show. We just talk about what we see with our eyes in the server, like, well, this guy, if Forgiven is better than him or whatever. It's like, maybe that's not the issue you're trying to solve for there. So I will say there are obviously extenuating circumstances where personal things go on, or people literally have arguments and like personality clashes where you can't, you know, there's an impasse you cannot get past. The problem is, obviously, I can only look from like the game performance side, and that's one area where I always find this very whack, because even though I appreciate, like you said there, Rich, basically what Cloud9 did in Season 8, where they benched a bunch of the big names, obviously Sneaky and Jensen were the two most notable ones, and then the idea was, through a mixture of having good enough results with the subs, they were able to sort of potentially rehabilitate where those guys were at, like attitude-wise, or, how they fit into the team, or maybe they just didn't pull rank, because they were kind of the superstar names before. I get that that's a factor, but the problem I have with this scenario is that at least makes sense, because in that kind of a scenario, assuming it's true, you always eventually do intend to reinstate the real player that you did sign to play for your team. The angle I don't get is this sort of a move by, like, things that we could say there, like the angle that they're moving him to, he's going to lead the academy squad. That almost makes it sound like for some reason they're just moving away from this player and potentially they really believe this other guy, even if it's temporarily, should be the replacement. That's the angle I've never really understood. Because let's be real, one thing about esports that does not in any way translate to real sports, and we just had to go through this in CSGO, is all subs and sixth men and academy players in general are not on the level of the real starters of your team. This isn't like fucking where like Manchester City can bring in some other amazing international level player to replace like a winger that they take out of this game now, and therefore if that winger acts up or if he's just not playing well, yeah, you would consider replacing him. Like in real sports, that is a thing. In esports, and particularly in games like League and CSGO, where it is basically about the 5 players you sign, and the rest are just a different factor, like for the future, or you want to sell them or whatever. Like, I don't really buy that angle, because what they always try to do, Rich, is like, they always make it like the idea. They always pretend in the press release, like, but this guy's got all this talent and potential. It's like, yeah, but he's not Zven, is he? Like, if he was, let's be real, what are the odds you'd have him on your academy team? Wouldn't he be on someone else? Wouldn't he be Dignitas as starting, AD carry or something like? I've always found that part. It feels like the Team Orgs, they sort of like push the bullshit angle a bit too far. And I don't really buy that they believe any of these academy players, beyond rare examples where they're like 15 now or something, they're too young. I don't think any of them really believe that the players can replace the starters.
So there's one like small aspect I guess, which doesn't, get talked about too much, which is you also have to factor in the academy team staff, right? And there's this strange dichotomy where they want to do well and perform. They want their academy team to perform well. I can tell you that I'm pretty sure most orgs don't care as much about the actual overall team performance of the academy team as the individual head coach for that team will, right? It's usually, sure. But also this guy wants to keep his players because he wants to perform well, and that makes him look better as a coach. But also it makes him look better as a coach when players get, instated into the main team from the academy team, right? So I don't think we should necessarily underestimate or at least rule out the possibility that this guy's being pushed perpetually by his academy team coach, like, trust me, this AD carry is really good if this guy just had his chance, blah blah blah. And not every team scrims in the same ways, right? Like a lot of organizations, they'll scrim their own academy team like multiple times a week. Some teams won't do it whatsoever, because remember this whole thing of like, I don't want to scrim against someone who could potentially replace me and my job, blah blah blah. And that's particularly prevalent in North America, right? So it could be the case that the academy coach literally thinks this guy's fire, and if there's been even like, I don't know, a small issue, or they felt like a dip in performance or something like that, if they've constantly got this guy in the team's ear of like, trust me, this guy's really, really good, and pushing this player, he might be pushed beyond his actual means as a player. I'm not saying that Jack would have caved to that necessarily. I'm just saying that this could be a factor as well, that maybe he's actually, a scrim god, and the academy team's been like pushing for this guy to get starting position. And as ultimately as well, we don't know what the reasoning is or how permanent this move is. It could literally be the case that this guy is out of the starting lineup for the first couple of weeks and then immediately comes back in. We don't know, right? I think it's worth noting that if you were fully promoting a player, and you were feeling very confident that this guy was going to be the starting player for the whole season or whatever, you would probably do some kind of promotional piece on that player. I would actually think that would be like
during the last split or something.
Right, yeah. And that didn't really happen. Yeah. It was just Jack in front of a cam, sort of ad hoc style. So my guess, as I said, is that Zven will be back let's say midsummer would be my guess.
Okay. Yeah, I'll assume the same. I'd actually assume he's going to come back.